Alright, this is going to be part 2 of the September-October topic analysis, resolved on balance public subsidies for professional athletic organizations in the United States benefit their local communities. If you didn't debate the topic at camp or you didn't see part 1, I would recommend looking at that now. This one is going to be more delving into specific arguments for each side. And again, not losing track of the big picture, what is the purpose of public subsidies? Why is the city giving them out? Because what the city's goals are is necessary to determine before you decide where the local community's needs are met. So with that said, we're going to start looking at 3 common pro arguments and then a few common con arguments. So the first pro argument that you're going to see a lot of teams reading is that it helps raise property values. That by giving up 1 or 2 blocks of the city as being property tax exempt, and by spending a lot of money on them, it causes other areas in the local community to have their property values rise. And if this is downtown, it is usually referred to as urban renewal. If this is in the suburbs and it extends the city towards the site of a stadium, it is usually referred to as urban sprawl. Either can be argued as being good or bad. So pro needs to watch out for both link turns, that is, this is actually going to reduce property values or hurt the local economy, or impact turns, that urban sprawl or urban renewal is in and of itself bad. So this argument is certainly runnable, but needs to be able to be defended on both levels, which means that evidence needs to be picked a little more carefully, with a little bit more of a discerning eye for how it's going to play out in later speeches when you're writing the case if you put this in there. Generally speaking, when you're looking at raising property values, you're probably looking at the Federal Reserve Bank studies that talk about this. I believe the Pittsburgh one has the most optimistic projection, but not necessarily the best substantiated projection. If your opponents point out that it's looking at it over 30 years, if your opponents point out that it could have been done privately, if your opponents point out that this assumes everything goes perfectly in terms of the team's success and the team not demanding any more subsidies, it can fall short, but it sounds like a very glowing projection to start off with. Most of the other reserve banks are somewhere in the middle. Generally speaking, property values going up isn't inherently good in and of itself. Yes, houses are more expensive. What you need to do then is actually link in why it is good for property values for businesses and homes to actually rise. And the easiest way to do this is probably talking about property taxes. Now again, this is not the same thing as raising rent directly. It's not making it more expensive to live in the city in and of itself, though there will be secondary effects that cause that, which you're going to have to defend or mitigate to some extent. But generally it's saying, this makes properties people already own worth more. This raises property taxes fund education. Funding education creates better schools raise property values even more, which creates more property taxes, which creates better education, and so on in a positive feedback loop. This is an argument that pro teams can make that can usually internal link turn a lot of con arguments, because a more educated local community or a better educated workforce are both things that can access a lot of the impacts that Con may be talking about better than they are, as long as you can prove that it will happen, and then it will happen in a timely enough fashion not to be undermined by any negative economic effects that Con says might short-circuit that. So property values rising is certainly one common pro-argument to hear. And again, when you make this argument, you need to be able to define the scope of local community. You don't just want to say property values rise within 6 blocks of the stadium. You want to be able to say the amount of taxes foregone and the amount of money spent is outweighed by the amount of money gained in increased revenues from property taxes, which are then spent in ways that benefit their local communities. You need to be able to complete that analysis to win on this point. Okay, the second pro point I mentioned primarily because it is a very common one at multiple different camps across the summer, and pops up a lot in literature for people who don't feel like dealing with numerical analysis. And that's the civic pride argument. And sometimes it's called group identity, sometimes it's called social cohesion, sometimes it's called something else, but it's that basic idea. It gives people in the city a sense of common ground, a sense of belonging, it adds to the character of the city, so on and so forth. This argument can be taken in a few different directions. The difficulty is weighing it and impacting it. It's fine for a team to say, oh, we don't want to just look purely at financial impacts. We want to look at these other kinds of less quantifiable arguments as well, but if you do, you still need to give the judge a way to evaluate those. For instance, if you are winning it increases civic pride, and they are winning that it decreases local employment, how do you show which is more important? Because Pro is not trying for a tie, they are trying for a win. If Pro cannot prove whether the resolution is true or false, then their arguments become kind of meaningless, and it's hard to say they've actually affirmed anything. I don't think that Pro actually has the burden of presumption the same way that affirmative does in other types of debates, because the three things that give that to them are not true here. But at the same time, if you are speaking first and you are defending the resolution, you want a reason it is true, not just a reason it is not demonstrably not true. So you need to do one of two things. You either need to link civic pride into a quantifiable impact, or you need to wash all quantifiable impacts and explain that if these are all uncertain, civic pride is a useful tiebreaker for a judge who doesn't want to have to do an econometric study comparing a meta-analysis of each team's economic projections over the next quarter, which a lot of judges would be very grateful for. So if you do that, you're arguing for a wash with defense on the other points. Economic projections fail, it works in some cities, it doesn't in others, we don't know why. Both sides are going to create economic numbers to support them. Anybody can make an economic report that says what they want it to say. If it is truly uncertain, the judge cannot say with any degree of certainty which side is winning the economics debate, then this should be a very easy tiebreaker for them. There are some things that money can't buy. This sense of belonging, sense of connectedness is one of them. And that's one direction it can be taken. Another direction you can take the civic pride argument is talking about how it deals with trust in local government, pride in local government, reductions in crime, that kind of thing. If you choose to do that, there's a couple things you need to be aware of when running the argument. The first is that turns certainly do exist. The other team can argue that this is going to create a spike in domestic violence surrounding the games. They can argue a correlation in the other direction between pro sports and crime. They can argue that subsidies are not actually helping with the civic pride, and they certainly also are capable of arguing that civic pride isn't actually a benefit in and of itself. Having a group identity is not always a good thing. It depends on what the identity coalesces around. If what the identity is centered on is worthwhile, then maybe this point is strong. If the identity is around something not worthwhile, the point gets a lot weaker. One can also talk about how this might be tied to sports teams more so than to the city. I think that Pro can come back from this fairly easily. They can talk about how when sports teams leave cities, the city tends to stop caring about them or start caring about a new team that eventually comes in and replaces them. They can talk about Indianapolis and Baltimore, for example, with this. There's plenty of other examples that exist as well, but that's probably the most publicized. If you're looking at civic pride in terms of teams versus cities, you can also talk about what happens when players who were very popular on a team leave a city and go to play on a different team in a different city, and where the team pride transfers to from there. I'm not going to name names like Cleveland, Ohio, for instance, but there's certainly some recent examples of that people can play around with. I've also heard some people try to argue it more directly with a lives impact by saying that civic pride and group identity help lower suicide rates, or that group identity is key to avoiding depression, key to having a sense of belonging. I don't think this is a particularly strong argument. I think the cards for it are not in the context of the kind of group identity that comes from watching somebody throw a ball on TV. I think these are more in the context of group identity of people who have single-digit number speakers of their native language, people who are on a reservation together and cannot afford to move off of it, those kinds of things. So you want to make sure that the evidence you are using matches the context, otherwise it's not going to go well for you. The other thing about subsidies is a strong point on the other thing about civic pride that is worth mentioning is, even if the civic pride is not in the city itself, the pride being in the team can still be a good thing for the city. You don't necessarily need to defend that it links back to the city itself. You can certainly argue that by linking it in to the team, that draws businesses, that draws hotels, that draws, again, a positive feedback loop of economic investment where people come into the city to watch the games, eat at restaurants, stay at hotels, etc. And there can be a right and a wrong way to go about this. The con team is going to argue this drives pre-existing businesses out of the city, this creates big chains, and the urban renewal done wrong, like we talked about a little bit in the first pro point, is a problem. Pro needs to defend that we're not doing this the dumb way, that urban renewal can be done right, that it can be done by lifting up the existing communities, existing local business owners, and not by driving them out, which we'll talk about more on con. The last pro argument I want to talk about is the idea of group identity, being able to allow the city to influence. So basically, between the subsidies and people identifying with the team, it gives the city a way to influence how these professional athletic organizations, which would exist in the city anyway, and would capture the city's imagination anyway, how they function. So for instance, you can non-unique a lot of arguments that Conti makes here. These might be reasons why sports are bad, but because of the combination of interest and identity, these subsidies allow the city to direct them more productively. Sure, there might be cultural problems with the way pro sports are played. But what we can do is we can actually look at these and say, okay, we can reduce these by putting conditions on these subsidies. You can have this subsidy as long as you do X, where X can be codes of conduct for players, where X can be relations with local businesses, where X can be green technology on stadiums. And these are all things that, when tied in with the idea of group identity, not as a contention of its own, but just as an internal link to this one, can spill over beyond the stadium itself. For instance, people who would want nothing to do with solar panels because they see them as emblematic of another party's politics that they don't like, but who are huge fans of their sports teams, might want something on their house that looks like the new stadium looks if the new stadium is a green stadium. So this would be another example of how one could actually use these subsidies to influence the teams to do things in exchange for subsidies, to influence the stadium owners to do things in exchange for subsidies in ways that will then be modeled by the players, which will then therefore be modeled by the local citizenry. So the way this argument plays out is, well, Khan has said a lot of bad things about professional sports' existence, but they're going to exist anyway, and we can moderate, mitigate, and control those and shape them in a more productive direction if we have subsidies tied to better behavior and better practices from these professional athletic organizations. So that's the last pro argument I'm going to talk about in depth here. There's certainly other pro arguments. If there's one that you are interested in or one that you are not sure how it plays out, feel free to leave a comment or a message, and I will try and talk about it in a little more depth later on in follow-up. For now, I'm going to switch over to the con side. First con argument's fairly straightforward. This is the net economic loss. This is con going through the debate instead of around the debate. It's going to be a card-heavy argument, but it's one that a lot of the lit supports the con team on. Basically just that the city does not get its money's worth out of these subsidies. Seen purely as an investment, purely as a transaction, these subsidies cost the city more money than they bring the city. So that's certainly one way that this can be looked at. If you choose to do that, there's not much good that my talking about it here is going to do. You need to actually read the studies, read the literature, be able to explain why yours are more accurate than theirs, why the empirics are on your side, and why the examples you choose to talk about illustrate a trend, while their examples are selectively ignorant instances that choose to only look at the best parts of the best cities. The second thing that a lot of con teams are going to talk about is eminent domain. Eminent domain is when government seizes private property for public use. So for instance, if the government wants to build a highway and 99% of the people whose houses would be in the path of the highway agree to sell their houses, and one person doesn't, the government can build the highway over that house anyway, as long as they give the person fair market value for the house, and as long as it is agreed to be in the public interest. Eminent domain is kind of a necessary power for a government to have. If a government were at war, and a defense contractor who supplied them with fighter jets knew that they could raise the price to anything they possibly wanted, and the government would have to pay, and they were being held hostage, and there was no way they could possibly seize them, then the government wouldn't be in charge. The defense contractor would. So, on some level, eminent domain is a necessary evil. However, eminent domain in the context of stadiums is not being used by the government. It's being used in a way that they say benefits the public without actually going to the government. And an example of this would be how the New York stadiums were built. And that's going to backtrack a little bit to a Supreme Court case called Kelo versus New London, where the Supreme Court decided that eminent domain could be used for the benefit of private corporations as long as the government thought it would improve the local economy. Again, that's a very shortened version of the case. If you're going to run the argument or you come up against the argument law, I would recommend reading both the majority decision and the dissent. When you're looking at eminent domain, there's two ways to run this. The first way to run this is to talk about how it's the only thing that's actually inherent to subsidies themselves, because the gift of the property that was seized by eminent domain was an in-kind subsidy. If you run it this way, you're probably talking about it more in terms of corruption. You're talking about it in terms of how this creates a way for local politicians to bribe large business owners in their local communities by giving them land that belonged to other people in exchange for campaign contributions. The other way to talk about this is in terms of a gentrification. The second way that you can approach the eminent domain argument is from a social justice or a gentrification standpoint. The idea that eminent domain is very often used when clearing space for these stadiums, with the stadium merely as a pretext, and the idea being to force some undesirable group out of the city. This can be targeting poor people, this can be targeting minorities, this can be targeting tenement housing, but generally speaking, the argument the con team is making here is that the subsidies may be for the professional athletic organizations, but that is not the goal of the in-kind subsidy of taking the land away and giving it to them. As a matter of fact, certain real estate developers have freely admitted that they only built a stadium to be able to also build luxury housing near it and to have eminent domain used. The other way that this can be used as well is for people who are landlords who do own large amounts of apartment housing and who would like to be able to sell it to the government for what they consider fair market value immediately without having to give their tenants time to move out or warnings or eviction notice or anything like that. They could just do that and then start over buying into the new company developing the land. So for instance, if somebody owned projects outside of New York City, and I wish this were a hypothetical example, and they wanted to sell them to the government, they make a donation of a few $1 million to the city government, to the mayor. The mayor exercises eminent domain and buys all of their apartment buildings from them. Their tenants have 30 days to move out before the buildings are leveled to build the stadium. The stadium ends up taking a tiny fraction of the space, and the rest is devoted to luxury apartments, which the original owners then end up owning partway as well. It's a win-win situation for everybody except the people who actually live there. The landlord who owns the property benefits, the mayor gets campaign contribution and benefits, and the professional athletic organization benefits, but the actual people who live in the local community do not benefit. So that's another direction that Khan can approach this from. This becomes more powerful when Khan talks about this in terms of cycles of corruption, especially in the context of subsidies as loans. So for instance, there might be a situation where a team says, give us a $50 million interest-free loan, or we leave the city and establish ourselves elsewhere. We need this for a new stadium. The mayor says, sure. He knows that it's a loan that he can say is going to be paid back. He knows that he's not going to actually have to deal with the economic consequences of this years down the road when he's no longer in office, but that if the team did leave the city, he would be seen as the mayor who let the team go and would probably lose the next election as a result of that. So the consequences are not his problem the way he sees it. So he makes the loan, and again, it's a win-win situation for everyone except the local residents. At that point, you get into a situation where, when that loan is due in 10 years, they go to the city and they say, hey, give us a $100 million loan, or we leave. Same deal, mayor's in the same situation, which is largely no win. What happens then is 50 million of that goes to pay off the original loan, and again, when this loan is almost due, you see the same thing with a larger number again. And it's in each mayor's interest to push it down the road, because then it is not their problem during their term of office, it becomes somebody else's problem while slowly bankrupting the city. So those cycles of corruption are another way you can talk about this. Now, when Pro answers all of these arguments, they want to do so by explaining that this is simply a channel that these are expressed in, rather than being the reasoning for them. So for instance, a corrupt mayor would find someone else to give subsidies to, some other business to exercise eminent domain for, so on and so forth, that these are not a result of the subsidies going to professional athletic organizations, but are simply a result of having a corrupt government in the first place, at which point Khan needs to show some kind of uniqueness to show how this causes this, or how this makes this worse than it would be without. And that's what the debate is largely going to happen. This is not an argument that Pro really wants to try and impact turn. Aside from that, Khan can also go in a very different direction. They can take a more classically libertarian or conservative stance when talking about this topic and argue that public subsidies in general are bad. And this is useful because the people who would usually be aligned with arguing for the pro-sports organizations, for the values they represent, are very often against public subsidies in general and public subsidies elsewhere, which means that Pro has a hard time finding authors who agree with both halves of their syllogism. At that point, Khan can have a case which simply says that public subsidies to professional athletic organizations are bad because public subsidies are bad, and the government should be interfering minimally in the economy and should not be picking winners. This doesn't have to go into full-blown objectivism, but it can certainly talk at things from more of a free market economic standpoint, and how if a business requires government support, then the city shouldn't be investing it in the first place. The fact that it needs a subsidy is also a reason that it ought not be subsidized. This can also very often fake pro teams out to the left and then go to the right, where a lot of their arguments are going to be assuming a different underlying Khan philosophy than this Khan team actually runs. If you choose to go this route, I would not run it with many of the other Khan points because it is philosophically inconsistent with them, and if the pro team digs into the writings of your authors for both points, they will find contradictions that you will have to explain your way out of. The last thing that Khan can do is just argue against pro sports in general. And again, there's tons of different reasons that can be given behind this. Generally speaking, when this happens, it's going to be arguments about the social effects, it's going to be arguments about the other things they crowd out, it's going to be arguments about what we value as a society. And it's not saying necessarily that athletics themselves are, but that the pro sports industrial complex as it exists, what it does to these athletes, why it causes us to glorify them, why people watch NASCAR for the crashes, watch football for the concussions, and enjoy seeing people destroy their bodies for the benefits of their fans and owners, while still ending up being millionaires at 25 and destitute at 30 and suicidal at 40. And just arguing that that in general is bad, and as a result we shouldn't be subsidizing it even if the subsidies are profitable. Those are a sampling of the different Khan arguments. Again, there are many other Khan arguments out there. As for the pro arguments, leave me a comment or send me a message. There are ones you want me to go into more detail on in the follow-up, and we'll talk about that if there is a part 3 for Resolved on Balance, Public Subsidies for Professional Athletic Organizations in the United States benefit the local communities. This topic is going to develop a lot. It's going to be the topic from the very first round of the year up until the end of October, when Beltway, Bronx Round Robin, Big Bronx, etc. all happen. In the meanwhile, the topic's going to evolve a little bit, but probably not too much. There aren't big changes as far as policies for professional athletics or for the subsidies to them that seem to be in the works for them. If you have new evidence, that's great. You should always be cutting updates, but you're willing to do more work to emphasize why the newness matters on this topic than you will in many other topics. Saying our evidence is 2 months newer than theirs doesn't necessarily mean too much. Saying they're reading the same evidence that every camp used for this, we've actually gone out and cut something that responds to that and takes their evidence into account, is much better. Again, any other questions? you know several ways to get them to me. I will try and address them either directly to you or in a third follow-up to these if I get enough. Hope that helps. Hope to see you at the September and October tournaments on this topic. Good luck.